Locked On Podcast Network presents Locked On Sports Today.
Today, we answer the question, which team has fallen the furthest? We're taking a look at the teams that once owned the mountaintop and are now an afterthought. Do the Los Angeles Lakers hold that title? What about the New York Yankees? Or is it the Notre Dame Fighting Irish that outpace everyone in this category? Today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply.
I'm Peter Bukowski, starting your day with the can't-miss stories and biggest debates in sports. You're Locked On Sports Today.
Searching all major sports. Found.
Let's start with the biggest story.
Well, before the king was on their roster, they were absolutely the kings of the NBA for a while. But things for the Lakers have kind of simmered down just a little bit in terms of expectations. But that doesn't always have to be the case. Here to break down where the Lakers are, where they were, and where they're headed is Andy Kamenetsky, part of the Locked On Lakers podcast. Andy, when you think about the glory days, the peak of the Los Angeles Lakers, what stands out to you as maybe the key portion of Lakers kind of history in terms of what's celebrated the most these days?
I think it would be a tie between Magic's 80s and Kobe's 2000s. And obviously Magic's 80s, you have 5 championships with Showtime. The first came in 1980 during Magic's rookie season, which happened to coincide with Dr. Buss's first season owning the team. And also at a time when, frankly, the NBA was in a lot of trouble and needed saving.
True.
So you had Magic and Larry Bird. That decade really helped lay the groundwork for what the NBA is now, and it helped build the Lakers mythology. And then in the 2000s, the Kobe Bryant era, you had the three-peat with Kobe and Shaq from 2000 through 2002. Then you had back-to-back titles, Kobe with Pau Gasol, Lamar Odom, Andrew Bynum, Derek Fisher. 2009, 2010, there was also a finals appearance in 2008 without Shaq, and then a 2004 finals appearance with Shaq. Those are both losses, but you're talking about 7 finals appearances in a decade. And then I don't know off the top of my head how many finals appearances there were for the Lakers in the 80s, but I know they lost a few. They basically were in the finals just about every single year. So take the 80s, take the 2000s, the first part of the 2000s. Those are the Laker picks, the Laker peaks. I don't think you can pick wrong.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of that division comes down to who saw what, right? Like that ends up being the big deciding factor of it. I love your highlight of the 80s because of the idea that, like, not only did that establish the Lakers franchise or further establish the Lakers franchise, but as you mentioned, it saved the NBA in a way. And how do you ever compare to that? So when you have a franchise that has had that kind of level of success, what do the expectations look like, let's say in the last half decade to decade? And how has this team lived up to those expectations, if at all?
Well, the Lakers' expectations are always high. I mean, they between their history and the way that they brand their history, which I think at times it can become a trap for them. Like at times, I think they can become a prisoner of their own legacy because you can't realistically, particularly in today's NBA, which is very different than the NBA that Dr. Buss conquered. You know, it's a different CBA. There are different restrictions. There are now billionaires that put the, just sort of, I guess, run of the mill Buss family billionaires to shame. Like, say what you will about the Clippers, but Steve Ballmer could buy the Buss family just for fun. Sure. And he's not alone in owning a team that has more economic resources than the Lakers. And you combine that with the CBA that is more difficult to just bring in stars, no questions asked, as long as you're willing to pay for it. And also the new reality of a world with social media and all these different individual branding platforms for players, where all of a sudden being in Los Angeles it can be the tiebreaker between a couple different situations. And there definitely are great marketing opportunities, particularly if you're with the Lakers when they're great. But you don't need to be in Los Angeles to be seen anymore. Damian Lillard became a massive star only in small markets. Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook launched their careers in small markets. Anthony Edwards, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, these guys are becoming huge stars without being in one of the truly marquee markets. And that is a challenge for the Lakers that I think they're still quite figuring out how to navigate.
So keeping that in mind and looking at where they are now, is there a chance that you can see this Lakers team or some version of this Lakers team in the future maybe reaching a third peak to a point to where it contests with those Kobe Lakers, those Magic Johnson Lakers? How far away are they from either reaching a new peak or even reliving a peak from their history?
I think they're pretty far away. I mean, first of all, the teams that we were talking about, they were dynastic for a decade. They had back-to-back championships. And if you're defining what we're talking about right now as the LeBron, Anthony Davis era, they do have a championship in 2020. And that is a major achievement, even if you are a Laker fan. And I think sometimes Laker fans become spoiled by their own success. You have to recognize championships are precious and they are hard to come by. But that being said, LeBron is 40. And this team only has so many years left at high competitiveness with LeBron and AD just because of the age. And they are not currently one of the realistic front runners to win the championship this year, much less try to set themselves up to repeat. They're not a bad team. They won 47 games last year in a brutal Western Conference. And a lot of fans would argue had Darvin Ham done a better job coaching them, they could have won 50 plus. So clearly they're good, but the gap between good and great, and then great and championship caliber, it can seem slim, but it's very tangible. And the Lakers are right now just one of those teams that they're good and they're competitive. And if a few things broke right for them, could you picture them in that mix? Yes, but they're not realistically in it. And in order to make that happen in the current LeBron era, it basically has to be ready-made. And I just don't see that.
Stay up to date all year long with the Los Angeles Lakers by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Lakers on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Thanks for making Locked On Sports Today your first listen. Coming up, the New York Yankees were once on top of the baseball mountain for years and have not been there since. But before we get to them, we're going to take a look at a few teams who just missed the cut from being the team that fell the furthest. GameTime makes getting to the ballpark even faster and easier. Prices on the GameTime app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, and their best price guarantee, GameTime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. They're obsessed with finding ways to help you save money on your tickets. GameTime has deals on tickets right up to the start of the event and even up to an hour after it starts. It's the place to find last-minute seats. Find exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And with the GameTime guarantee, it means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, GameTime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the free app today, and new users can get $20 off of their first purchase with promo code LOCKED ON. Terms apply. That's code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase with GameTime. Download the GameTime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. If you're catching this episode after checking out your favorite Locked On podcast, don't forget to subscribe on Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Every year is the Dallas Cowboys year. Well, at least up until it isn't. And then next year then becomes the year. Now, you see, pictures have surfaced of quarterback Dak Prescott in a walking boot. And reports are that he's fine, but it does kind of have to make you wonder, doesn't it? Will 2024 be yet another year where the Cowboys miss the mark. The 1990s were owned by the Cowboys, and since then, they've been all bark and no bite. You can blame whoever you want, but make no mistake, the Cowboys aren't the toast of the NFL and haven't been for a while. It sure feels like they have an argument to get away from this group of teams as soon as possible and win a championship. But don't tell Cowboys fans that. Hockey is Canadian, right? I mean, that's where the league got its start. So wouldn't it make sense that the most dominant teams would be, well, up north? Looking at you, Toronto. The Maple Leafs once owned championships every year, but that was the 60s. That was the original 6. Since the league has expanded, the Maple Leafs have been relevant in simply conversation only. Forget about not having won a championship since 1967. The Maple Leafs haven't been to a Stanley Cup final since 1967. What have you done for me lately is too soon to talk about the last time that the Maple Leafs were a relevant team on the ice. One of the most historied franchises, not just in baseball, but in sports in general, the New York Yankees have looked like they've been in a little bit of a tailspin as of late. Here to take a look at where they sit now versus what the expectations were and where they have been throughout their history is the wonderful Stacey Gotsulias from over at Locked On Yankees. Stacey, as we begin this conversation here around the New York Yankees, I'd love to start off by looking at kind of when they were most dominant in the league. When is it the last time or maybe the peak time that the Yankees were the absolute best baseball team in MLB?
I think their main peak was probably pre-Jackie Robinson when they won in the 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, it was just a constant barrage of Yankee championships. Obviously, recent history would be the 90s dynasty. And, you know, you haven't seen anything since then. The closest that baseball has come to that tied between the Giants winning every other year in the early 2010s and Houston making all those ALCSs recently and winning 2 championships. But I would say in modern history, it would be the 90s, the late 90s into 2000s.
What was it that made them so special during that time?
They were able to rebuild when the commissioner suspended George Steinbrenner back in the early 90s, and he wasn't running the show. And it was the only way the Yankees could do it was to completely rebuild, go through a few bad seasons, and bad meaning like 20 games below 500, and working their way slowly back up, drafting well, and getting rid of some of the bigger contracts and building the team in a completely different way. And it feels like that might be the only path back to that kind of glory. And I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, that hard reset button can sometimes work, but it's really hard to push it sometimes as a franchise, and especially one that has so many expectations. And so when you look at the expectations versus the outcomes of the last 5 to 10 years, where would you kind of rank the Yankees in that conversation? Have they lived up to the expectations, or where have they been there?
They have been a disappointment because I would say 2017 was a surprising year. That was the year where they came back against Cleveland in the first round, and they had that really fantastic ALCS against Houston and pushed them to 7 games. No one expected the 2017 team to do that. And that was the first full year of Aaron Judge. You know, Gary Sanchez was there. And you just, as a Yankee fan, you felt like the mid-2010s doldrums were over, and that maybe, maybe this is the start of something good. And it's not like it's been completely terrible. They've made the playoffs most of the seasons. It's just they haven't made a World Series, which is a big deal for everyone because we're going on 15 years of that. And as a Yankee fan, it's kind of hard to deal with hearing other people talking about it and saying, the Yankees haven't made a World Series in 15 years. And it's hard to be the fan of a team that has had so much success, because when they don't have as much success, everyone likes to, dog on them and say, what's happening with them? I mean, it's not like the Yankees are finishing in last place. Last year was the first time that they had a pretty bad season in about 30 years, but they still didn't finish under 500. They were 2 games over 500 last year, and that was their worst season since I was in high school. So,
Yeah. So it seems like it's one of those things where like sometimes the expectations can be very high for a franchise that has a history of success. And sometimes when the expectations are at a 10 and you're performing at an 8, it feels like a quote disappointment, even when it's not necessarily a disappointment by most franchises kind of standards. And so keeping that in mind, a lot of people are talking about where the Yankees are today. Oh, it's a tailspin. It's all these other things. How far are they off right now from either realizing that success, or dare I say, how far are they off right now from maybe re-achieving some of that peak success that they've seen throughout their history?
Yeah, this is a very strange season because they overperformed in the first 2 months and a half of the season.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're just the complete opposite. And I feel like there's a happy medium in there. You know, this isn't a team that I'm expecting to win the World Series right now, as they are, but I'm not expecting them to be as bad as they've been the past 3 weeks. This is just, I don't know if someone has a voodoo doll or what's going on, but something weird, because it literally was like a switch was flipped and they went from being really good to being one of the worst teams in the league. And it's just very odd how that's happened. And I don't think they're that far off from being the type of team that could make a World Series. There's just some parts that they need to tweak, and there might be some changes at the top that they need to make in order for them to get to the next level.
So the biggest reactions have come from the extremes of them being at their best or at their worst this season, where really, surprise, the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
Stay up to date all year long on the New York Yankees by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Yankees on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Coming up next, the college football team that has fallen the furthest isn't really a competition. The Fighting Irish own that title. All right, everybody. So look, there are very few organizations and school programs out there, athletics programs that transfer off of the field and into pop culture. But one of them is absolutely the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. And here to take a look at where they are now versus where they have been and now where they're headed is Tyler Wojak of Locked On Irish. Dude, when we take a look at where the Fighting Irish are now, what is your take on what was their peak? Like, where was Notre Dame at its absolute best?
I think that depends on who you ask. It's definitely a generational question. If I were to ask my dad what was the peak of Notre Dame, and for context, I'm 28, my dad's in his mid 50s right now, I think he would undoubtedly say the Lou Holtz era from like 1988 through 1993. They won a national championship in 88. They were runner-up in, I think, 1990. They were in the mix in 89 and 93 as well. So there was a good 5 or 6 year stretch, really, where they were in the mix for the national championship every single year. But unfortunately, they only left with one national championship. Now, if my grandpa were still alive and I were to ask him the same exact question, he would probably have said the 40s and the Frank Leahy days. I think they won like 4 national championships in a 10-year span. So by that metric, just pure championships, yeah, they were killing it in the 40s, but football was a little bit different back then. So I think that the correct answer, or at least the answer that is going to be agreed upon by the most Notre Dame fans, is probably the Lou Holtz days.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I should have said too, we're looking at Notre Dame football in particular, which of course is like the global brand that comes from the Fighting Irish, of course. And so as a part of that too, what about the last like 5 to 10 years? What have the expectations been around Notre Dame first? And then what's the reality and how is it compared to what those expectations are?
I think the last 10 years, if you look at it in totality, starting in 2014, sort of the second half of the Brian Kelly era to now, I mean, there have certainly been bumps in the road. The 2016 season was a debacle. They went 4-8, but for a 5-year stretch, Notre Dame was one of, if not, I should say one of the most consistent programs in college football. I think they went 54-9 in Brian Kelly's last 5 years. And I think, you see the record in the big games during like the college football playoff when Notre Dame got absolutely housed by Clemson. They got smoked by Alabama in the national championship. Like, I get it. I was at both of those games. Not a whole lot of fun in the stadium, but also it's not like there's a whole lot of other teams that are beating those teams that I just mentioned. So I feel like Notre Dame fans, you're always going to have some fans who have unrealistic expectations and think that they should win the national championship every single year. And it's a disappointment if they don't. But I think now in the modern era of college football, most fans have a more rational outlook about Notre Dame. And I think especially in this expanded college football playoff era that we're about to embark upon, I think making the college football playoff should be the expectation every single year. Now, that just means you have to finish essentially in the top 12. As when it comes to like making a run at the national championship, Notre Dame's just not going to be doing that every year. They're probably going to have a decent chance one every 3 to 4 years. And as long as they're in the playoff, they're in the mix. And then you've got one really good team every few years that you can really get your hopes up with. And I think that's sort of the realistic expectations that most Notre Dame fans have nowadays.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And look, hey, getting into the top 12, a lot easier than getting into the top 4 on the backs of some questionable voting decisions and things like that. So at least there's that going for them as well. So as you look at Notre Dame now, in terms of where they're headed, where they're going, how close are they now to one of those peaks? How close are they now to meeting those previous expectations?
It's an interesting question because I think this new playoff format sort of changes everything. Right. On one hand, they're going to have more opportunities because I think they're going to make the playoff way more often than they did in the 14 playoff. And even in the 14 playoff format, they did make it twice. So they were still very competitive. To be honest with you, I don't know if they're ever going to come close to the peak of the Lou Holtz days where they're competing for a national championship every single year. And to be clear, like that's okay. Yeah. I think that college football is different. The run that Alabama just went on when they absolutely dominated for so long, like I know that Georgia looks like they could make another serious run like that. I just think it's so different now in college football because there are so many good teams. I mean, back then, Notre Dame was one of the only teams every single week who was on national television, and that was part of the appeal. Whereas now so many different teams have a big national brand. So it's a little bit different. There's way more parity in that respect, and it's just tougher to win every single year. So on one hand, I'm not sure it's attainable for Notre Dame to ever get back to those days when they're competing for a national championship every single year. But I do think that they're certainly trending in the right direction. They have things figured out with NIL, which is obviously massively important. Notre Dame,
true.
At first, they were a little bit reluctant to give a bunch of money to football players. I think that has changed, and that's good because Notre Dame has never really been an institution that has been hurting for money. So I think in that respect, they're making some like headway there. They're getting back to where they need to be. But this is honestly going to be a critical year. Like if Notre Dame can make a serious run in the playoff, I'm not just talking like winning the first round game. If they can win a couple games, make it to the semifinals, and they're in the Final Four, not only is that a big deal for this season, but I think it matters so much about the perception of Notre Dame to younger athletes who, frankly, didn't grow up in a time where Notre Dame was all that competitive at the top of the college football space. So it's an interesting question now. I think they're headed in the right direction. Let's have the same conversation in like the end of January. And I'm either going to be feeling one of two ways. Either, wow, we're on our way back. We're back, baby. Notre Dame is going to be in the mix for the national championship again. Or it's going to be like, I don't know if Mark Freeman's the guy. We might be starting from scratch.
Stay up to date all year long on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Irish on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. A franchise that has been irrelevant for too long, the Pittsburgh Pirates, made a questionable decision on Thursday. Their young ace, Paul Skeens, Go Tigers, had pitched 7 no-hit innings and struck out 11 Milwaukee Brewers. Deciding that was somehow enough, Pirates manager Derek Shelton pulled Skeens for reliever Colin Holderman. The relief pitcher promptly allowed not 1, but 2 hits at the top of the 8th inning. So you see, sometimes not even star players can save an irrelevant franchise from the trash pile. If you're catching this episode after checking out your favorite Locked On podcasts, don't forget to subscribe to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And if you're new to Locked On Sports Today, we're here for you, bringing you the biggest stories in sports every day. Coming up on the next Locked On Sports Today, who will hear their name first at the MLB draft? So at least until tomorrow, stay locked on sports today.
Locked On Podcast Network presents Locked On Sports Today.
For more episodes of Locked On Sports Today, go to our video on demand. Click on sports at the top of your screen. There, you'll find past episodes of Locked On Sports Today, plus other Locked On shows on demand.